Hi friends, I hope all is well. Now that my altered book sketchbook is completed, I brought out another sketchbook that I haven't used in quite some time. I like to get it completed during this month. It's a Strathmore mixed media pad with 90-pound papers that are 5.5 by 8.5 inches. Let's see how many of these pages I can complete this month. I like adding a guideline by the gutter so I have a straight edge to glue the papers against. I brought out a jar of matte Mod Podge to use for this collage. The matte finish should help prevent the pages from sticking together when the sketchbook is closed. It was late in the day when I started this collage session. I didn't have a design idea going into it. Before filming, I pulled random papers from my leftover scraps container. It may sound odd, but I was letting the scraps dictate the design. I was trying to use the scraps as is or with minimal alterations. As I'm auditioning the scraps, I have in the back of my mind to use ones that are representing all three values and various sizes. I gave myself some leeway on varying the shapes because, like I said, I don't want to alter the scraps too much. Besides using my own painted and monoprinted papers, I like using ephemera such as this scrap from an old Thomas guide. It's from the section with the street names and numbers. I love the uneven, torn edge where I removed the page from the spiral binding. This scrap helped to develop the design. I wanted it to be somewhat prominent, so I didn't use any other similar Thomas guide scraps or papers with white in it. I marked where the two horizontal elements will be glued because there'll be other elements glued slightly underneath each one. These other elements will be placed vertically. The Thomas guide element will be glued down later as well. That's why I'm checking the placement of the two elements on either side of it. The design is coming together. I'll add music at this point and come back to discuss the final collage. For not having a design in mind before starting this collage, I'm happy with the way it turned out. The Thomas Guide scrap is still prominent. I like the contrast of the large bluish-gray horizontal element against the other narrow elements. I love the muted color palette as well. Here's the grayscale version. It has a strong contrast of predominantly light and dark values. Let's go on to the next day. I'm still working in the Strathmore Mixed Media sketchbook. I brought out more leftover scraps and 2 stamped deli papers. I'm starting by using fluid matte medium to glue down the stamped deli paper. I prefer to use acrylic medium to glue transparent papers to the surface because it keeps the transparency. There's only a small amount of it in the jar, so I'm taking the medium directly from it. Usually I put a small amount of the medium in a cup because I want to keep the medium in the jar pristine. It wasn't necessary since there's only a small amount of it left. When gluing a large piece of transparent paper to a surface, I find it best to glue it in sections to avoid too many wrinkles. I'm okay with some wrinkles, but not too many. This stamped deli paper was the inspiration for the design for this collage. I wanted to keep as much of it showing, so I decided on a diagonal composition. I decided to bring back out the jar of matte Mod Podge to glue the painted papers. I could have used the fluid matte medium, but I wanted to see if I could use up the small bit of Mod Podge that's left in the jar. I started by adding dark and mid-tone value elements, as well as large to mid-size ones in rectangular shapes as the base layer for the diagonal composition. I like to start diagonal compositions this way, then add smaller or narrow elements on top. Even though I want to keep as much as the stamped deli paper showing, I have no problem covering more of it if it's needed to have a well-developed design. I don't have anything else to say at this point, so I'll add music and come back once the collage is finished. This was a quick and easy collage to make, due in part to the stamped deli paper that covers most of the surface. I like the contrast of it against the painted papers. The grayscale version shows that the collage is mostly mid-tone with accents of dark and light value. Let's go on to day 8. Once again, I'm working in the Strathmore sketchbook. I'm determined to use it as much as possible this month to get it completed. When I'm not sure of the design, I go back to the basics, so I decided on using a vertical composition. I drew very loose vertical lines to help guide the placement of the elements. Also, as I say a lot, I'm being mindful of having all 3 values represented along with the elements in different sizes and shapes. For this collage, the shapes will be rectangle and square to fit into the vertical orientation. The sizes will vary, including very small, narrow accent elements. I pulled a large amount of leftover scraps and larger painted papers for this small surface. I tend to do this because I like having paper options. Also, it helps when I can't decide on what papers to pull, so I just pull them all. Having a limited color palette is also helpful. I pulled mostly blues and greens. I'm not being too concerned about cutting the elements to the exact width, just getting it close enough so the vertical sections aren't leaning into a diagonal, which is a different composition. I'm pulling very narrow elements for the next section, but before I glue those elements in place, I want to work on the section along the right edge. It can be helpful to glue the wider elements on either side of a very narrow section first, then glue the very narrow elements on top. I want to make sure there's enough width on the very narrow elements showing, so that's why I like to typically glue them down last. Also, I like having a very narrow section in the middle of 2 larger size sections. It will add a size contrast to the design. I'll add music while you watch me finish this section, and I'll come back for the next step. I could have stopped at this point because it's a well thought out design, but I decided to take it a step further. I pulled a few bright pinky fuchsia scraps to add some geometric shape accents on top. These shapes I like to call bridges. My thought process was these elements added contrasting colors and will be used to frame the vertical elements underneath them. I didn't want to cover too much of the elements on the first layer. Also, I'm not adding too many of these pinky fuchsia elements, just a few odd number elements to elevate the design. I haven't talked about how long these collage sketches have been taking to create. As you notice, I do speed up the videos. This collage took me 45 minutes in real time, which is longer than it usually takes me for these daily collages. The extra time that I'm taking is helping to develop a more thought out designs. The three pinky fuchsia elements elevated the design. I like that they added color contrast along with shape contrast. Also, I like that the ends of these elements are uneven. It's a very subtle thing, but it does add a nice detail. Here's the grayscale version. It shows that there's a balance of all three values. I'm still working in the Strathmore sketchbook. The scraps on the left side of the sketchbook were the color inspiration for this collage. A different one than I usually use because it's a light muted color palette. That's why I love having a sketchbook practice. It gives me the freedom to try different color combinations along with different techniques. I want to point out that the light reddish transparent scraps are altered bleeding tissue papers. I have a video on altering bleeding tissue papers that I'll link in the description area. The papers on the right side are ones that I thought would work with the inspirational scraps and keeping this collage leaning towards a muted color palette. I decided that this collage will have a diagonal composition, even though I just made one on day 7. I didn't want to overthink the composition or design. I'm not adding guidelines, so the diagonal placement of the elements won't be an exact 90 degrees. I'm also tearing the edges, which will add to the unevenness of the design. Only one side of the paper will be torn because one short edge will be cut along the gutter of the sketchbook. The other short edge will be cut off the page, and the bottom edge will be covered by the next torn edge paper. This will be a simple design as well, but I will be mindful of varying the widths of each element. The length will be varied due to the inherent design of a diagonal composition. For this collage, I'm using Mod Podge to glue the painted papers and Golden's Gloss Medium to glue the light reddish transparent papers. Since I'm leaning into a lighter value collage, I'm being mindful of including some mid to dark values, even if it's a small amount. Like the thin expressive black circles in the first element, this gray paper is mid-tone. I'll add music while you watch me finish this section, and I'll come back for the next step. I trimmed the papers that were hanging off the edge so I had a better look at the finished size. This will help me when I do the next step, which is adding the light reddish transparent papers. I love the shapes of these papers as is, so I'm trying not to alter them too much before gluing them into place. I'm auditioning this piece to see how I like it on top of different sections of the collage. I'm taking into consideration the shape and size of the paper and how much of it is covering the collage underneath. I decided on this placement because it only covers part of the white and orange striped paper, and it darkens the top of the next paper so it reads as another element. I'm adding medium to a section on the left edge of the transparent paper to secure it in place before gluing the rest of the paper down. I will add 2 more pieces of this transparent paper to balance the design. I tend to gravitate towards odd number of elements because it's visually pleasing to me. I like this light muted color palette. I made a note to use it more often. Here's the grayscale version, which reinforces the mostly light value collage. Adding the light reddish transparent papers darkens some of the areas, so some of the sections read as a dark value. Let's go on to the final collage for this video. My plan is to challenge myself to use the leftover scraps that I wasn't sure how to use in one collage. I'm trying to use the scraps as is, but I did end up cutting a few pieces to fit into different areas to balance the design. Even though these pieces wouldn't necessarily work together in a collage, I'm still thinking about what constitutes a good design, like having all 3 values, also having elements in different sizes and shapes. I don't have anything else to say at this point, so I'll add music. At this point, I took a pause to have a good look at the collage to see if I like it as is or if I need to change it. I like to share my thought process in hopes it'll help you when you're working on a collage. I ask myself questions like, are all the different color combinations on the different elements visually pleasing to me? We all have personal preferences when it comes to colors, so it's something you need to decide for yourself. Other questions such as, are there varying sizes and shapes? Are there all three values represented? And is it balanced or unbalanced? I even converted it to grayscale to get a different perspective. I decided that I preferred the grayscale version of the collage. It didn't look so busy to me as it did in the color version. This confirms to me that the collage needed to be toned down for me to like it. So I decided to add a thin layer of off-white paint on top of it, then add a few leftover collage pieces on top of that layer. The first layer of the collage will still be somewhat visible, but it'll be toned down. I prefer to use off-white paint instead of white because white is too bright for my preference when I want to tone down artwork. The first layer of paint dried a bit too light, so I added another layer. Once the paint layer dried, I brought out some of the same leftover scraps. I'm using the painted collage as the guide for this final layer of elements. I didn't want to add too many, just a few so the design would be balanced. I wanted to add a few small narrow pieces to connect all the elements together so it didn't look like they were floating on the surface. This collage certainly took a journey. I hope to help to show you my thought process when a collage isn't developing successfully. This collage design ended up being better because it has those different layers that work together. Here's the grayscale version, another collage that leans toward light value. The next video will include days 11 through 15. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Take care.